Welcome back to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a really fascinating piece of source material today. It's a concise but honestly highly critical excerpt from a text simply titled Text. Now, what this author has done is actually step back from the exhausting daily headlines to analyze a much bigger, overarching pattern in Elon Musk's recent high-profile projects. Rather than getting totally lost in the weeds of, any single news cycle, this source attempts to map out the exact architecture of how these massive endeavors are presented to the public versus how they actually play out in the real world. If you really want to understand the mechanics of modern hype and how visions of trillion-dollar budget cuts or immediate sci-fi futures actually land, well, this is absolutely the perfect place to start.
So, the author's central thesis can really be boiled down to three core elements: big promises, drama, and often under-delivering. Today, we're going to neutrally examine the documented history the author uses to back up this specific claim. We're going to look at the evidence provided by the source of massive, world-changing hype that is consistently followed by underwhelming and sometimes downright chaotic real-world results.
Okay, Part 1. DOGE, Chaos Over Cuts. The source material begins by targeting the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. It uses this as the primary case study for how this pattern operates at a governmental level, where obviously the stakes are incredibly high. The initial expectation was just monumental, right? A promise of literally trillions of dollars in sweeping federal cuts to eliminate government waste. But according to the source, the reality was starkly different. Not only were those promised trillions in cuts completely missing, but federal spending actually went up. That glaring gap between the bold initial claim and the grounded reality is exactly the pattern the author is highlighting here.
And it wasn't just a failure to hit a financial target either. The source states that DOGE was ultimately just a mess. It caused widespread confusion, resulted in really hasty mass firings, and ultimately operated as, and these are the author's exact words, more spectacle than real efficiency. So the crucial takeaway here is that the initiative generated an enormous amount of public drama and headlines, heavily fulfilling that second part of our core thesis, but it completely underdelivered on its foundational financial promise.
Moving right along to Part 2. The autonomy illusion.
Applying this exact same lens to the tech sector, the author targets the long-standing promises surrounding full self-driving and the whole concept of autonomous robotaxis. The text points out that full autonomy has been promised to arrive next year for well over a decade now. It's this continuous, repeating loop of broken timelines. Year after year, the expectation is set that a world-changing leap in transportation is just 12 months away. It is the ultimate big promise.
But we really have to contrast that decade of promises with the actual technical reality. To do that, we need to understand what Level 2 autonomy actually means. Level 2 is a system that certainly provides advanced support, things like steering, braking, and acceleration, but it absolutely requires a human being to be watching the road, completely alert, and ready to take control at a moment's notice. It is fundamentally a driver assistance system, not an autonomous driver.
And that brings us to the pretty sobering reality grounded in the source text. Despite over 10 years of hype, despite the endless loop of next-year promises regarding fully autonomous robotaxis, the technology is still just Level 2. It still needs a human watching. The expectation of a sci-fi future crashes into the reality of a system that, while definitely impressive and advanced, fundamentally underdelivers on the grand claims of full autonomy.
All right, Part 3. Demographics and distractions. Shifting our explainer into the realm of societal concerns and demographic fears, we see the expectations versus reality narrative pop up yet again. The dramatic, highly attention-grabbing claim made by Musk is that population collapse is the single biggest threat to human civilization. It's totally apocalyptic. But the source counters this by bringing in the actual experts. According to demographers, that claim is heavily exaggerated. The data shows that the world population is actually still growing and is projected to peak later this century, not immediately collapse. And this just brilliantly illustrates the pattern once again, doesn't it? Introducing high-stakes drama that, upon closer inspection by experts, simply doesn't align with reality.
Finally, Part 4. The True Cost of Drama.
So, what does this all mean? What is the true cost of this drama? Well, the author synthesizes a series of rapid-fire controversies, linking them all back to the tangible consequences of this specific behavioral pattern. Because it's not just about missed deadlines or exaggerated claims. First, under this leadership, the Platform X saw significant spikes in hate speech. Second, there's a real physical, financial toll. The author explicitly notes that the leader's highly publicized politics actively alienated the consumer base and tanked Tesla car sales last year. And finally, the text points out the severe structural issues at play, specifically citing clear conflicts of interest operating at the very highest levels.
Perhaps the most critical contradiction raised by the author is the glaring conflict of interest inherent in a business leader actively slashing government departments and personnel, while his own private companies are simultaneously receiving and benefiting from massive government contracts. It really represents a monumental collision between public duty and private gain.
Which leaves us with this final, really vital question to ponder. As we've seen through the source material's breakdown of DOGE, the delays in full self-driving, the exaggerated demographic claims, and the tangible fallout across X and Tesla, a really clear pattern emerges. What happens when a leader's private financial interests and massive public, even governmental influence are so deeply intertwined? When the pattern relies heavily on big promises and drama, but consistently underdelivers on the reality, who ultimately pays the price for the spectacle? Thank you so much for joining me for today's explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the gap between the headline and the reality.